Welcome, today's story is full of drama. Like and subscribe to stay updated. Let's get started.
Hotel room $92, room service $145. Your credit card company calling to tell you your fiancé is with another man. Priceless. At least I didn't marry her. I heard that consolation a lot over the next few years, but it offered me no comfort. We hadn't exchanged vows yet, but in my heart, I was already committed to her. The breakup felt just as painful as a real divorce would have. But let me start this story from the beginning. It was the early 1990s, and I had just returned to civilization after nearly 2 years in South Korea with the Air Force. I was stationed at McKinley AFB in Jacksonville, Florida, not far from home. I was young, eager for life, and looking forward to wrapping up my last military assignment with as little drama as possible. I enjoyed my job as an Air Force cop, but I had bigger plans for a long, successful post-USAF career, one that didn't include staying in the military for the long haul. As a kid, I had always wanted to be a cop, but by the time I was out of high school and ready to apply at the local police academy, I realized my chances of making it were slim. The current mayor was slashing the city budget, particularly targeting the fire, police, and other service departments. He cut the number of new cadet classes drastically. They now required applicants to have at least 2 years of college and other law enforcement experience before even being considered. Needless to say, they weren't hiring fresh out of high school 18-year-olds. Fast forward a few years, and the city saw a sharp rise in crime and some of the worst fire and EMS response times in the nation. The budget issues never got resolved. Whatever savings there were got spent on other questionable projects. As a result, city services became a national joke. I heard that new mayors were still trying to clean up the mess left behind, but that's another story. I needed both some college and some practical experience. I had no luck getting on with the local sheriff's department either, so I picked the next best thing. I joined the Air Force and was approved for my first choice, law enforcement. This certainly beat the alternative of SP, security police, which usually meant standing guard duty out on some airplane hangar runway or bomb storage bunker, often in the rain or snow. The job wasn't too bad, but it's never really fun to be a junior enlisted person in any career field. There was always something urgent happening that required us to work 12-hour shifts without a day off for a week or two. So I didn't get much playtime or get to see much of South Korea off base. I did have a very understanding NCOIC, the top enlisted boss of my section, who was very pro-education and extremely supportive of young airmen more interested in taking night college classes than drinking beer every night at the Airmen's Club. He made it clear with my supervisor that I would always be able to take a few hours off to attend my classes, even if we were in the middle of a base alert or working an extended shift. Returning to the States for my next assignment, I found that things were a little different. McKinley AFB at the time was one of the largest bases we had, but my unit was stationed in a remote annex of the base up on Security Ridge, out in the middle of nowhere. Shuttle buses to the main part of the base ran irregularly and far between, and for all practical purposes, even with a car, if you were stationed there, you were pretty much trapped. Even the nearest branch of the local community college wasn't close enough to be convenient. Worse, my new work schedule rotated duty shifts every month, making taking any educational classes virtually impossible. The new job wasn't bad, but it wasn't nearly as much fun as my last base. I had been used to duties being rotated so that everyone got to do a little of everything: disturbance calls to base housing or dorms, traffic control, admin, base ops, and so on. But here on Security Ridge, everything was 100% boring routine. I'd sit at a desk every day, checking security badges going in and out of our main building and dealing with the mountains of paperwork generated by anything else that entered or left the building. Boring was an understatement. Even our enlisted dorm was usually dead quiet, with nothing interesting ever occurring. My roommate, Greg, usually went clubbing every weekend, but since his tastes ran to country and Western music and I preferred 70s Brit progressive, I didn't often join him at first. Eventually, the boredom of either just working or staying in my dorm room changed my mind, and one late weekend evening, I joined Greg clubbing. That's when I met Natalie, as the Beatles song goes, and then I saw her standing there. She was about my age and standing in a corner of the club with a girlfriend, nursing a drink. She seemed rather out of place and not particularly into the music either. Another guy had asked her to dance earlier and she had accepted, but she plainly didn't know the dance steps and had to improvise badly. He spent the remaining dances with her friend instead, and she began to look increasingly bored and restless. She wasn't conventionally beautiful, but she had something about her that made her stand out from the other, better-dressed, made-up women in the club. She looked like someone's lost kid sister. The proverbial girl next door who had made a wrong turn somewhere and ended up lost in a strange and not entirely friendly new world. Her hair was long and in my favorite auburn brown color but appeared a little lifeless, as did her cheeks. She was apparently wearing very little, if any, makeup, and her skin appeared to be a little sallow and blotchy, as if maybe she hadn't been well lately. She was quite tall and thin but appeared to hunch her shoulders a bit, as if she were trying to become less conspicuous, to hide better into the woodwork. Still, despite the many surface defects, she had something. Since her girlfriend was busy dancing, I decided I at least wanted to talk to her. "Hi. Since neither of us seems likely to be dancing anytime soon, I thought I might as well try and help you hold up this part of the wall." Not particularly witty or clever, but it was vaguely original and had the obvious merit of sincerity behind it. She gave me a weak smile but didn't try to escape. We chatted for a bit about what music we did like. Definitely not what the C&W Club was playing, and compared favorite bands. She liked heavy metal music, especially Metallica and Ozzy, and had never even heard of my favorites, Genesis, Pink Floyd, Yes, and the Grateful Dead. We compromised on our only overlapping band, Led Zeppelin. An hour later, we were having a late dinner or early breakfast at a nearby diner, trading life stories until about 4 in the morning over endless orders of English muffins, which she ate as if she hadn't had a proper meal in days. Actually, she really hadn't. She was staying with some friends, sharing an apartment, and none of them had the money lately for groceries. She had a part-time job working as a hostess at a local restaurant, but the pay was not very good at all, and she didn't get a cut of the tips either. I saw her again the next Friday night. We had intended to go out to a decent restaurant for dinner and then see a movie, but we got badly distracted when briefly visiting my dorm room, and we never made it out of bed until after 10 p.m. Sleepovers in the dorm by members of the opposite sex were a major no-no, and although the odds were very low of getting caught, many guys routinely did it. I didn't feel particularly lucky at the moment, so we grudgingly got dressed and had another late-night dinner out at Joe's Diner. The sex had been really good. Neither of us were virgins, but we had both been out of circulation for a while. It had just felt special between us, and the more we were with each other, the harder it became to say goodnight. We started calling each other nightly and even managed a few quickies during the week, until my work schedule did its monthly change, and I moved from day shift to swings. Being on swings actually helped our love life. She would get off work around 10 p.m., take the bus to our favorite diner, and wait for me to get off work at 12:15 a.m. I'd grab a bite to eat, and then we'd go to her apartment, make love, and I'd crash there most nights, only returning to my dorm room to shower, shave, and put on a clean uniform before going into work the next day at 3 p.m. It only took me about 3 weeks of this routine to decide that I wanted to marry her. And while she was a little reluctant when I asked her, she didn't say no. I pushed for a fairly short engagement and a quick wedding, but she dragged her feet and had numerous minor excuses for why we shouldn't rush. Her standard fallback excuse was that things had been a bit rough for her lately, and she was still trying to get her head screwed back on straight. I should have recognized this for the warning that it was and backed off a bit, slowing things down until she became a little more comfortable. She tended to have a very nervous disposition and became distracted, frustrated, or frazzled very easily with only minor provocation. Her mood began wildly swinging in big up and down cycles that ought to have given me other warnings. She also began to alternate between being hyper-affectionate and clingy, which I admit I liked, to being very standoffish and even averse to being kissed or touched at all. Other times, she would be so jittery that she couldn't even sit down. She would talk incessantly and so fast that I could hardly understand a word she was saying. In a phase like this, she would go for 2 to 3 days seemingly without stopping, let alone sleeping. That should have been yet another warning of a different kind. I admit I didn't know very much about women and could figure out even less why she was suddenly acting so very odd. In the end, I just attributed everything to engagement nerves and decided, belatedly, to give her a little bit more space. cooling things down enough so that she wouldn't have a complete breakdown before the wedding. The final date, however, remained under much debate. I was on my last day of swing shift when I got a strange and fateful phone call at work at about 6:30 p.m. from my credit union. One of the few nice things about working up on Security Ridge was that there was a branch of the local military credit union 2 buildings down from my dorm building. They handled all of my military pay via direct deposit, made low-cost car and house loans for military personnel, much better than the national chain banks, and even offered us an ultra-low interest rate Visa card. Since I was now back in the States and needed something for emergency use only, I signed up for one at the time when I set up my other accounts. As a security measure, I checked the box that said this would be an infrequent use card and gave them the right to investigate any and all transactions made on the card. I gave them my duty phone and dorm room phone numbers for immediate contact. In those days before electronic verification, when most places took a carbon imprint of your card, stolen credit card numbers were epidemic, as they still are. At least once a week while in South Korea, I would have to file a stolen credit card report for other service members who had been victimized, and I was determined that it wouldn't happen to me. But apparently it had. The agent from customer service was asking me if I had just checked into the Evergreen Hotel off of I-95 in Jacksonville. Definitely not. I checked my wallet and found that my Visa card was indeed gone. Also, the nearly $220 I thought I had in my wallet was now missing. The customer service agent didn't have any other records of its recent use, but since most places didn't call or have electronic means of verification of a card, that didn't exclude the possibility that my card had already been used in other places all over town. I asked for and received a callback number, then got a fraud case number before hanging up on her to report the situation to the Jacksonville police. My direct boss, a pretty useless second lieutenant, aren't they all? Didn't want to excuse me from the remainder of my shift, but he couldn't prevent me from calling up our company first sergeant to get our CO to overrule him. 15 minutes later, I was on a dinner break and on my way to the Evergreen Hotel, where it was confirmed by the desk clerk that I had checked in about an hour ago. More specifically, a young couple had checked in about an hour ago under my name and using my credit card. After I proved who I was and declared that my card had been stolen and used fraudulently, the clerk got the evening manager, who was quite helpful and called JPD to dispatch some officers to arrest the thieves. The responding officer, a middle-aged Hispanic female, took down all of my information. It helped that I was a member of law enforcement and still in uniform. After getting another key to my room, we went up, and I opened the door for her. The couple we had expected to find were not in immediate sight. They were showering together in the bathroom at the moment, but they had apparently been quite busy. There were at least 6 department store shopping bags on the floor, a large bag from a local liquor store chain on the table in clear sight, and in the room on the dresser were some narcotics and narcotic smoking paraphernalia. At least, I thought, the department store purchases could probably all be returned. Okay, so the potential financial damage didn't seem too bad. The worst part was finding out who the culprits were. Natalie, and my roommate, Greg. I admit now that my own life was saved by some miraculous accident. I had inexplicably left my .38 service revolver lying on my desk back at work. Technically, it was a mandatory part of my uniform that I wore it at all times, and I couldn't remember ever having taken it out of my holster and just leaving it anywhere, let alone on a desk. This was an unspeakably rookie mistake that no junior law enforcement member would have ever made. But today it saved their lives. I swear, the second I saw them coming nude out of the shower to see what the noise and fuss was about, my hand went to my empty holster. I haven't the slightest doubt that I would have fired my weapon and killed them both on the spot. I knew at that very moment what otherwise insane urges drive husbands to shoot their wives or their lovers when caught by surprise in the act. But for the happy accident of leaving my gun, Natalie and Greg would have undoubtedly met that fate. And instead, it would have been me in handcuffs, awaiting murder charges. Neither of them was very happy to see me, and they were even less happy about being taken away in handcuffs in the back of a squad car. Seeing Natalie's look of abject shame and hearing her cry all the way just crushed my soul even further. The arresting officer seemed to think that I was in no mental condition to deal with the situation any further and pretty much ordered me back to base to do whatever reporting I needed to do there and let JPD handle their end of the job. With nothing left to do, I returned to work for the remainder of my shift. In the morning, I filed a theft report for the stolen credit card at the main law enforcement office on the base and parked myself in a chair in front of my first sergeant's office at 7:59 a.m. to give him a complete and unvarnished statement of the facts. He ground his teeth a bit, but didn't find any fault with my actions. Even my leaving a firearm unattended, albeit in a secure area. He ordered me excused from all duties for the next 3 days and told me to go to the clinic for a narcotics test, then get some sleep. Greg was released from Duval County Jail after about 2 days, but I never saw him again. He faced a nice collection of UCMJ charges, which also included cocaine and amphetamine use and dealing. OSI, Air Force Office of Special Investigations, tore up our dorm room and found even more narcotics in his locker and car. He wisely pled out on the mercy of the judge and got a slightly reduced sentence at a federal holding facility that wasn't Leavenworth. He also got a dishonorable discharge, loss of all stripes and pay, all the usual penalties. I did hear later that he successfully appealed to be allowed to remain in the service, starting over again as an E1. He eventually finished up his career working in the Social Actions Group, teaching about narcotics and alcohol abuse. I spent far more time over the next 6 months dealing with OSI than I would have liked. They tended to assume every airman was guilty until proven innocent. I must have spent over 100 hours being questioned and signing statements there, but I was eventually cleared of any involvement with Greg's narcotics dealing. My service record remained clean, but that was a rather weak silver lining compared to the storm cloud of my breakup with Natalie. Natalie faced only civilian charges, mostly misdemeanors for the theft and fraud charges. But she was soon in much bigger trouble for cocaine and methamphetamine possession charges. I also soon found out that she had an existing felony check fraud warrant from another county. In fact, the assistant district attorney handling her case told me at our first meeting that Natalie had been in constant trouble with the law for at least the last 6 years since she became a legal adult. She had previously stolen money from her family, but those charges had been dropped shortly afterward. There was a sealed juvenile record for her as well, one that neither the ADA nor I ever got to see. But the conclusion was obvious. Natalie was a very troubled young woman with a long history of narcotics abuse. Apparently, she had tried somewhat to go clean since I had met her, but the pressure to use had become too strong for her. I refused to pay the money for her bail on the advice of the ADA, who said the extra time spent in county lockup before trial would be the best thing for her right now if she really wanted to get off narcotics. I didn't quite agree with her logic, but she did really seem to have Natalie's best interests at heart and wasn't just gunning for a slam-dunk conviction. Natalie stayed in jail and I tried to get on with my life. When all of the expenses had been totaled, Natalie and Greg had run up over $1,600 in their narcotic-induced shopping spree. But I was able to get most of the department store items returned and my Visa account fully credited, except for the $58 they spent at the liquor store, the $82 for the hotel room, and a $142 room service charge for a champagne dinner. In my opinion, the hotel had done everything correctly and by the book. They had actually taken the time to verify my card, so I didn't feel it was right to penalize them for being honest, and I paid those bills myself. At this point, losing just a little over $500 total, including the $220 in cash, was a miracle. I was more than happy to accept it. Natalie pled guilty to all counts but asked if I would visit her before sentencing. I refused. I was trying desperately to cut her out of my life and memories as if she were a cancer. It didn't work. Supposedly, it never does. I was also very guilt-stricken over the fact that I had lost so much emotional control upon finding her in that hotel room. I could and would have killed her if I had been carrying my revolver as I should have been. I just couldn't trust my emotions. If I were to speak with her in jail, I'd probably end up doing something foolish, like dropping all of the theft and fraud charges. The narcotics charges would still be there, though, and forgiving her entirely would have just led to the next time she went on a wild narcotic binge. It was safer for me, I thought, to just try and forget her entirely. I didn't go to her sentencing, but the ADA later called me up to tell me that she accepted the plea deal and received a term of 7 to 12 years in state prison, with a promise of early parole if she completed the narcotics treatment program and at least a year of counseling afterward. She offered to provide me with contact information for the prison Natalie had been sent to, but I declined. I told her I had no further interest in Natalie's welfare. And I didn't, nor did I start to show much interest in my own welfare. My last 6 months of duty in Jacksonville were, frankly, nearly more than I could bear. My lieutenant held a grudge that I had gone up the chain over his head and tried to make my life hell in the 1,000 little ways that a petty second lieutenant could. I was up for an automatic promotion from E3 senior airman to sergeant, also still E3, so no pay raise. The Air Force does a number of really odd and stupid things like this that are nearly impossible to explain to civilians. But my boss kept canceling my schedule to attend the training school, which was locally held on base and theoretically immune from normal unit interference, but not 100% so. My boss was watching me like a hawk, looking for every trivial and petty write-up on me that he could gig me for, and seemed determined to ruin my career. After the 3rd time in 6 months that I received a letter of reprimand that I was certain I hadn't deserved, I decided I had nothing to lose by going back to the first sergeant's office. I unloaded my gripes upon him for a while, but I got the feeling that since I had only about 3 months left in my enlistment and had not filed plans to re-up, his options were fairly limited. He wasn't going to stir trouble in the chain of command for a 3-striper who wasn't even going to be around much longer. But I do give him credit. He could tell that something else was wrong with me, something that someone else might be able to fix. "I can't order you to go talk to a chaplain," he said. "But I'd take it as a special favor if you would. Any of them, take your pick. Then come back and talk to me next week." We didn't have a chaplain up on Security Ridge. The closest one to us was actually a Lutheran pastor who had apparently drawn the short straw and had a small office on the end of the flight line, marginally closer to us than the main base chapel. I liked him, however, at once. He was a huge Nordic-looking Swede from somewhere in Minnesota, with both psychology and divinity degrees, and had the laid-back Northern Lutheran act down to a science. I told him my story about Natalie, and he seemed to hit upon all the significant details at once. Even noticing that, as I told the story of their discovery in the hotel, my hand again went to my pistol holster. Reluctantly, and bit by bit, I told him about how I had actually wanted to kill them, and how only luck or providence had spared them. We ended up meeting for an hour every day for a week until I realized a great truth about myself. Since my guilt over nearly firing my weapon at the woman I had loved, I now had great trouble even putting the holster on, let alone firing it. When I had originally done my weapon qualification with the .38, I had shot a 297 out of 300, easily enough to qualify for the Small Arms Expert badge. At my most recent trip to the range, I had done far worse, barely a 240, and I had many misses. The guilt was eating deeply into me, and worse things would undoubtedly start to happen unless I dealt with them. It was clear, however, that I was no longer happy being in law enforcement and wearing a gun. I was now psychologically nearly incapable of using it, even in self-defense. My choices were clear: cross-train into something else or get out of the service. Frankly, the cross-training idea sounded pretty good. "Can you type?" my chaplain friend asked. And I could pretty well, actually. He told me about possibly being a chaplain assistant and joked that I could type up all of his paperwork for him. We had a good laugh, and I admitted that there were probably worse things. It's hard to cross-train out of law enforcement under normal circumstances. Like the SP folks, we don't have a particularly good retention rate, and the behavior standards are stricter than in most AF skill classifications. Also, there have to be openings in your grade for the skill you want to train into. Usually, this meant a generally sucker job compared to the one you already had, like sitting in a missile silo somewhere in the middle of nowhere. I was lucky, however. With the help of my first sergeant, I managed to get a release from law enforcement and into the chaplain assistant training program at Maxwell AFB, where I re-enlisted for another 4 years. I found I liked the new job. It had a great number of cross-connections with traditional law enforcement, crisis and suicide intervention, emergency stress management, domestic disputes, plane crashes, and normal deaths were a common part of the job, and I became very good at it. The job was really a whole lot more than being a glorified church secretary, and I probably spent a dozen hours helping handle problems over the telephone or in person for every hour I spent typing up reports or anything remotely related to a sermon. Besides, by the time I made staff sergeant and later tech sergeant, I had secretaries that worked for me to do that sort of thing. Not being terribly religious wasn't actually much of a drawback. In fact, nowhere in my job description did it say that I even had to attend any services at all. But I had to know what was going on at all of them in order to better coordinate their after-church activities. As my new career progressed, at most bases I soon became the senior NCOIC, managing a staff that supported numerous different chaplains of all different faiths, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim. Some days, it would be the Baptist minister on call at 3 a.m. when an airman came home drunk and angry enough to start beating his or her spouse. Other days, it might be the Catholic priest or even the rabbi that got called at home. And then I'd be the next person called. It didn't matter much. They all had the same call to duty and did the job equally well. I never had the slightest problem with any of them. The crisis work was important and extremely fulfilling to me. But as I worked my way into the final half of my 20-year military career, I started to take more pleasure in the more mundane aspects, handling youth groups and various outreach programs especially. I didn't drink much anymore. I still enjoy an occasional glass of red wine, but it suddenly became more important to me to help co-host the base AA meetings with the social actions folks. I even worked a bit on the side with off-base NAR programs that always seemed to have a few below-the-radar military members attending. The military has always been a bit hypocritical about this. Being a drunk is almost expected and not punished too severely, but if a young airman gets caught with a joint, things can get a bit hysterical. Those seeking help for heavier dependencies, the smart ones anyway, try to take their troubles off base for help to avoid having their careers destroyed. I finished up my last tour of duty back in Jacksonville again, this time at Peterson AFB, where the Air Force did its basic training and had quite a few technical schools, along with its largest hospital, Clearwater Medical Center. I was the senior enlisted person managing a staff that numbered in the hundreds and handled tens of thousands of people every day. I had younger NCOs to handle the 3 a.m. phone calls these days, but I tried hard to keep my fingers on the pulse of things and handled my share of the personal tragedies. I had made Senior Master Sergeant some time back and had the offer of making Chief Master Sergeant dangling in front of me. But I had decided that I'd done my 20 years, and it was getting near time to move on and do something else in life. Plus, once you make Chief E9 the top enlisted rank, everything starts to become military politics. Sooner or later, my widening butt would end up sitting somewhere in the Pentagon, advising senior officers about what policies we should be enacting for the future. That didn't even sound remotely like fun to me. I had never married. Frankly, I hadn't even been much tempted. The people I tended to meet every day were all the ones with issues of some kind or another, and that's certainly not conducive to finding a mate. The women I'd meet off base were usually from other church groups or organizations with which I coordinated various activities. Very often, these tended to be church ladies of the zealot variety or professional organizer types who liked to run everyone else's lives, and I never got along with them very well. I loved my job, but I certainly didn't go to church 2 to 3 days a week. Once a month, I'd do a rotation of one of the different offered services just so I'd know the faces and names a bit better. The vast majority of the military women close to my age were either already married or divorced, with children from multiple fathers. And I just didn't have the ambition to deal with that sort of life drama on a long-term basis. The never-married women tended to either have serious issues or were not interested. I most definitely didn't have the time or the inclination to start going back to the local C&W bars. Frankly, nearly every military divorce I helped counsel seemed to start with, "Well, I met her at a bar. I wanted to meet a woman and start a lifelong relationship. But I didn't want another Natalie. I wasn't quite living like a monk, but I certainly wasn't getting anything resembling regular sex, either." With less than a month to go before my retirement, I was single and without any plans for my life after leaving the military. I would get along all right on my retirement pay and thought I'd stay in the area for a while and gently shop around to find a big church that needed a community affairs or youth group manager. I didn't get my hopes too high. Most of the churches in the region seemed to be either Southern Baptist or Catholic, and I was unlikely to be enough of a true believer to be hired and accepted. The remaining churches seemed to have a nearly similar conservative bent that would probably require more quality time on my knees praying than I was used to spending, especially in retirement. A Duval County Social Services office had some interest in my experience, but as their civil service worked strictly on seniority for promotion and not merit, with no exceptions, I would be starting fairly low near the bottom of their career ladder. I'd be spending my days handling neglected children, drug-addicted mothers, and system-abusing parents. I didn't think I could manage much enthusiasm for doing that nonstop for very long, so I turned them down. Another job with the local United Way office wasn't much more promising. Long hours, bad pay, inane office politics. But until I got a strange letter from a church in nearby Middleton, Texas, that appeared to be my best opportunity. The church had provided me with some basic details, and they had a rudimentary website that gave a few more nuggets of information. For starters, this church, usually just called the church locally, was built exactly on the border of a large nudist colony. Well, technically, half of the church aisles were clothing optional, and the other half fell on the prudish side. But to 98% of the folks in the county, it didn't much matter. It was by far the largest church in the county and handled a great number of civic projects, more or less by default. I was inclined to dismiss them out of hand as a bunch of kooks. But the more I read, the more fascinated I became with the extent of their duties. They managed the county food pantry for the poor. They built homes for low-income families and repaired the homes of seniors. They provided free breakfasts for children during the school year and lunches for low-income children during the summer months. They ran nearly all of the county's crisis management services, hosted monthly job fairs, and held weekly AA, NAR-Anon, and anger management sessions. That, of course, was in addition to the usual church youth and scouting groups. I was intrigued. I really wanted to meet the head pastor, Father Alexander Orton, or just Father Al as the locals called him. The man who had the balls and the ambition to put all of that together. Middleton was indeed an odd place, so having a very odd church pastor didn't seem at all out of place. Father Al was a very jovial man with a fat belly and a heart apparently even 3 sizes bigger. His age seemed indeterminate. He had first come to Middleton in the late 1970s, but he didn't seem any older in appearance than I was, except for his dark eyes. They bored deep into your soul, and if you looked long and hard enough, you could probably see eternity. The only eyes I had ever seen that came close to his belonged to an old retired veteran of World War II, one of the early liberators of a Nazi death camp. He had seen terrible things that could never be forgotten. Father Al was looking for a director of church services, someone responsible for everything the church handled outside of Sunday morning services. It was a huge job, one that could keep 5 people running nonstop from dawn until bedtime, assuming the phone didn't ring at 3 a.m. If I were to be offered the position, I would have a staff of 2. A part-time motorcycle mechanic named Tiny, who handled most of the children's programs, and a long-time church secretary. The compensation offered for the position was beyond pitiful, bordering on appalling. Father Al admitted this right from the start of our interview. "Money going to pay me," he said. "Couldn't be used to repair a widow's house next week or provide the Wallace kids with lunch and something to take home to their sick mother for dinner. Frankly, the person they were ideally looking for wouldn't even have pay in their top 10 want items for the position." Job satisfaction had always been at least numbers 1 through 5 on my priority list anyway, and I could honestly agree with his viewpoint. They didn't want someone who viewed this as a job. They wanted someone who would probably do the work even for free simply because it was important and needed to be done. Frankly, the job description kept changing weekly as they found more things that needed to be done. Things that the poor county government didn't have the money to handle. It was very clear that my first impression, church plus nudist colony plus youth groups equals big bunch of pervs, was completely and utterly wrong. In fact, now, I think I wouldn't even want to be in the same area as the poor sap around here who got caught even attempting to molest a child. I don't think they would even turn the mangled remains over to be prosecuted. As we talked, Father Al questioned me deeper about my military career and my previous relationships, both professional and personal. The questions grew harder, and it became increasingly impossible to hide any shading of the truth from him. Not that I had even considered lying, of course. It was just odd that it was completely impossible to sidestep or conceal anything other than the most utterly complete and fullest truth in my replies. He asked me what I had most liked and disliked about my chaplain jobs. I told him, the politics and dealing every day with people who had far worse problems than I did. Then he asked me to name all of my own perceived inadequacies in excruciating detail, even mentioning that I had started off my career in law enforcement but left that work after nearly making a horrific mistake that had haunted me for many years. At this, he smiled at me kindly and asked the $50,000 question that I had been largely ignoring for over 15 years. "Tell me about the worst pain that anyone has ever caused you." And did you ever forgive them for it? Oh dear God. I started to tell the story of my problem with my old OIC back at Security Ridge, the scumsucker lieutenant who was a full colonel now, I hear. But before I knew it, I was telling the real story. The story of my love for Natalie, her narcotic addiction, and how she betrayed me. An hour later, when I finished, I was bawling in his office like a spanked schoolgirl. He had somehow peeled off every layer of protective scabbing I had built over the years to protect my heart, which had also protected me from ever being able to want to love again. Now it was all gone, and the pain felt like it had just happened again yesterday. The answer, of course, was no. I had not forgiven her. Still, to this day. Probably because I had never entirely lost the love that I once had for her. This answer seemed to please him. He replied, "But today, if she walked into this room right now, could you forgive her in your heart and begin to move on from there?" I didn't know. I honestly didn't know. I said all the right things. I wanted to, I should be able to, I need to, I should. But faced with a firm yes or no, I just couldn't make that decision. The pain of the experience was still as raw as ever, and I was trapped once again in the emotion of it. Fine. That's a good, honest answer anyway. And it'll do for now. Let's talk about working with the folks that would be your staff, he said. And so we moved on. Could I work okay with an ex-biker named Tiny, covered in tattoos, looking big and scary enough to break me with just his little finger? But who was in actuality as gentle as a lamb? No problem. What about dealing with narcotic and alcohol addicts wanting to reform? Absolutely no problem. I gave him more details of my AA and NAR-Anon work. Then we hit the last hurdle. So, he said, if I were to tell you that our wonderfully outstanding church secretary, who has been with me for nearly 10 years and is utterly indispensable now, was once a serious narcotics abuser who willingly traded sex for drugs and became a convicted felon, would you still trust her? She stole money from everyone around her, her family, her friends, and her lovers, to buy narcotics. She was also blackmailed by her drug dealers to do other awful things that she deeply regretted afterward when she was sober. She reformed herself admirably in prison and is now a sterling example to others. I trust her with both my life and my checkbook. Can you do the same? Could you forgive her sordid past, which is now far behind her, and judge her only by what she does from today onwards? I thought for a moment and said, yes, I think so. I had learned a lot over the years about the stupid things addicts do that hurt themselves and others, and I had only the greatest respect for those who had pulled themselves out of that abyss and made something of their lives afterward. Good. Let me introduce you to our secretary. Assuming you were to be offered the position and accept it, you can guess now, of course. The church secretary was Natalie, or rather, she used her full name these days, Natalie Allen. We spent a moment or two avoiding each other's eyes, getting some good, long looks at the well-worn Persian rug on the floor of Father Ael's office. At length we spoke. We greeted each other by name. We started to shake hands. But we ended up hugging each other, tears in our eyes. That pretty much ended the interview. Father Al, with a wink, said, well, it seems that Natalie and I are old friends who have a lot of catching up to do. And we did. For the next 4 hours. At a wonderful, old-fashioned diner just down the road from the church, within sight of the beach. She had been clean at the time we met, but the friends she was staying with were still using, and they were providing a constant temptation to her. She weakened under stress and started to use a little to try and keep the edge off, which, of course, never works. And soon she was back to her old usage and habits. She needed money for narcotics. She was soon fired from her restaurant job for suspicion of theft. She had done it, but they couldn't prove it. My old roommate Greg discovered her weakness and was amazed at how blind my love for her had made me. He first blackmailed her for sex to keep her drug use a secret from me, and then, soon afterward, had her doing tricks for a local pimp for drug money, with Greg getting a cut of her earnings to keep her secrets. By now, he was using and dealing himself, and his own judgment was getting quite impaired, such as agreeing to the theft of my credit card, my wallet cash, and joining her on that shopping spree. She didn't even know why she did it. I had never denied her anything. She was just out of her mind on drugs, doing terrible things with terrible people in a constant downward spiral toward the gutter. As the internal stress of trying to hide her unacceptable behavior from the man she loved drove her nearly to the point of a nervous breakdown. She had loved me enough to avoid wanting to marry me, because she was sure that, since she was a full-fledged drug addict again, eventually she would do something terrible to hurt me. But she had never expected me to find her with one of her pimps in that hotel room. That was even far worse. Still, she realized much later that she should have come to me for help with the truth. But she loved me deeply and was terrified of losing the first real person who had genuinely cared for her. She was right. Faced with this awful truth in a Jacksonville jail, I undoubtedly would not have forgiven her. I certainly would not have taken her back into my heart or my life. And I probably would have said a great many words in anger that I would later regret. Faced with this direct and ultimate rejection, she would most likely have had little interest in rehabilitation. And, upon release from prison, she would have resumed a life of drug addiction and would probably now be a total crack and meth head, living under some bridge, recycling cans, and giving $5 blowjobs just to get by. Instead, she avidly sought rehabilitation and left prison on parole after just a few years. She began a new career working in social services, helping other addicts. She found her way to the church a few years later, by accident while on a trip. And ever since, she had made this place the center of her new life. She wasn't an avid nudist, nor did our jobs require us to be one. But it occasionally helped. I couldn't help but think to myself that she looked good, and I wouldn't mind one bit seeing her nude on the beach. We left friends, and for the first time in 16 years, my wounded heart had a proper bandage on it, and it could begin to heal. The next Tuesday morning, back at work in Jacksonville, there was an official written job offer in my mailbox. Would I accept it? I wanted to. I was 99% sure that this was where I was supposed to be now in my life. But still, that was not 100% sure. And I'd need to think about it for a few days. Father Al said there was no rush at all if I needed some time to decide. And I did. Had I forgiven Natalie? Yes, I think I had. Completely. But could I work with her every day? That part I wasn't so sure of. I knew now that I still loved her, and she still loved me. We seemed to be waiting for each other all these years. Single and never married to anyone else. Maybe it was just supposed to happen. Maybe it was always intended that way. But I needed to be absolutely sure of myself. If I walked into that door, we would hug again like old lost, but dear friends. We'd start doing lunches and dinners together. We'd start to hold hands. And sooner rather than later, we'd kiss. Then there would be breakfast together. And then marriage. Neither one of us was capable now of doing things halfway. I needed to make 100% sure that I could wake up in the morning and see only the woman I think I can love for the rest of my life. And not ever see some horrible memory from the past. Could I make that definitive commitment yet? Not today. Probably not tomorrow either. Nor likely during any of my remaining 3 weeks in uniform. But soon after my retirement ceremony was over, and when I took off my uniform for the last time, I think that last 1% undecided part of me would make that final choice for me. And I know I'd be able to live with it for the rest of my life. Life is full of unexpected turns. After everything, was this a second chance meant to be? Would you have made the same choice? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.